deeply appreciate all of them, because I think that this series is so interesting and a great gift to the community. Tonight's speaker, Dr. C. Paul Vincent, is Professor of Holocaust Studies and History at Keene State College. He chairs the baccalaureate program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He served as director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust Studies from 1998 to 2007. A PhD in Modern European History, University of Colorado at Boulder, 1980. He has taught at Keene State College since 1985, when he came to Keene as director of the Mason Library, a position he held until 1994. Professor Vincent is the author of 2 books, The Politics of Hunger, The Blockade of Germany, 1915 to 1919, and A Historical Dictionary of Germany's Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933. Currently on sabbatical, Professor Vincent will be teaching in Poland in the spring on a Fulbright scholarship. So please join me in welcoming Professor Vincent.
Thank you, Frankie, and thanks to everyone that's here. It sounds like I'm mic'd pretty well. You can hear me in the back? Okay. I feel very honored and privileged to be here this evening, and as a consequence, am overwhelmed by the number of people that have come out. I saw a whole bunch of you come in at once, and I'm assuming that you all came on the same bus or something. In any case, I mean what I said more than I normally would if I said that at any other talk, because Middlebury is a very precious place to me. I studied German language here 33 years ago now, 1981. It turns out Frankie and I discovered we were here at the same time. 3 years after that, I so fell in love with this place that I convinced my wife, who can't find a chair, she's out in the hall, that we needed to get married in Middlebury. So we came here. We were very poor at the time. We stayed out on Lake Dunmore. And in a place that was called Year's Wait. We had a little cabin, and chipmunks kept coming up through the floor of the cabin, you know. I would have loved to stay at the Middlebury Inn, but, you know, back in those days we couldn't do that. So my summer here has always been, reminded me of Hans Castorp in Magic Mountain, der Zauberberg. It was so idyllic. It was like being up in Himalayan mountains and not knowing what was going on anyplace else in the world. And that's quite literal, because the summer that I was here, I understood that we all had to sign a document indicating we would not use the English language while we were here. And many of you probably are. I understood, and maybe this was just a rumor that they like to spread around, that one of the other students had in fact been expelled because they found him reading Newsweek or Time or something like that. So I didn't know what was going on in the world, and I left here, and other than Hans Castorp, who went down out of the mountain and discovered that the First World War had started, I discovered that Ronald Reagan had fired all of the air traffic controllers who had been on strike, that Ortega, what was his name, in Panama, that suddenly he had disappeared over the summer. It was to find that the world had changed so much. So this has always been kind of my Magic Mountain experience, being in Middlebury. And this is the 5th time I've given this lecture for the Vermont Humanities Council. I always hoped that I would get to Middlebury, so it's nice to finally be here. Okay, what I want to talk about what life was like for the average German before the war begins. So roughly the first 6 years, we can say, of Nazi Germany. And I'm not talking about Jews. I'm talking about non-Jews, talking about what the Nazis would refer to as Aryans. And in order to get a feeling for what this topic is, I think I need to begin by telling you about, talking a bit about totalitarianism. And so as kind of establishing a foundation for you to understand what life was like, I think it's necessary for us to look at this term and to get a sense.
Fading in and out, you gotta stay on this side.
I'm fading in and out?
Yeah.
Really?
No,
Really? Okay. Okay. Good to know.
Your right of the podium, it seems to work better.
It works better over here. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I have a habit of walking a little bit, so I'll try not to do that too much. Okay. So what is a totalitarian regime? It's a system that is built largely on ideology and terror. And I think for Americans, these are concepts that are fairly difficult for us to grasp. Ideological politics, that there are people out there who are prepared to kill you for the sake of an idea. That's not something that we as Americans grasp very well, although I think in the 21st century we have a clearer understanding that that does in fact exist in the world that we live in. Certainly within the Nazi movement, ideas were to be killed for. But the question has been raised in many of you have probably heard of Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book entitled The Origins of Totalitarianism fairly early on after the Second World War. This book was published in the early 50s. It's a great book, I think, in that she develops, I think, the earliest model of what totalitarianism is. And she draws a distinction between what is a totalitarian state as opposed to what is an authoritarian regime. And she points out that a totalitarian state has an ideological vision of the world. It claims to have discovered the great truth for both the human past and the human present. And by understanding this, it has a guide to the future. Now, for the Bolsheviks, for Stalin, this ideology was based on materialism. Okay? Focus on class and class struggle and ultimately coming to a classless society. In other words, the ownership of the means of production somehow has something to do with what the world is shaped as and what the future can be. For the Nazis, race was the central element. Race is the only way that we can understand the course of history. And so for the Nazis, racial ideology plays an absolutely crucial role. And translating that ideology into policy, into practice, was fundamental. Now, if you know the key to history, if you're armed with that key, it's necessary to act. Totalitarianism, a totalitarian party, believes that it stands at a turning point in history. It's discovered this truth, okay? And so it has a historical obligation to act and to implement that ideological vision. If it fails to act, it's committed a terrific historical sin. And so it's essential to do this. Now again, these are concepts that I think are difficult for us to understand as Americans, but nonetheless, I think we need to understand this.
Can we ask questions, or do we just talk?
At the end, yeah, I think there's enough to cover, so jot it down, okay? What are the parameters of totalitarian action? Well, if it means trampling over traditional bourgeois notions of morality, if it means taking extraordinary action that can lead to the killing of women, the killing of children, the killing of other innocents, so be it. It's morally just because crimes in the short term are necessary for the greater good in the long term. Okay? This is probably the worst case scenario of the ends justify the means. Extraordinary goals demand extraordinary measures, is basically what I'm saying here. The judge is the course of history and the ideological truth that is possessed in this instance by the party. So in summary here, we're looking at a blind commitment to an ideology and then a ruthlessness in implementing that ideology. And these then will characterize a totalitarian party, a totalitarian regime, a totalitarian state. Now, within this structure, and we've talked about ideology, within this structure, you have to also have a system of terror. And terror then becomes a central feature of totalitarianism. Once in power, totalitarian movements establish not simply an ideological reinforcement through certainly a propaganda arrangement, a way to indoctrinate subjects, but the party also creates a system of terror, something that will hold the population in place. And one sees this certainly with the emergence of the SS, gradually with the emergence of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei. Gestapo is an acronym, a shortened version of the secret state police. Moreover, the claim of the state is to the total person, and this is a fascinating concept. This is in fact where the idea comes from, certainly as defined by Hannah Arendt. A totalitarian regime recognizes no distinction between one's public life and one's private life. In an authoritarian regime, if you basically keep your nose clean, if you obey the laws, if you put out the flag on the Duce's birthday, speaking of fascist Italy, and I'm making a distinction here, I think, between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, the chances are good that you'll be okay. Totalitarian regimes, however, don't simply seek compliance with the law in an objective sense. Meaning you can get in trouble, obviously, if you commit a crime objectively. But the desire is to control one's private life as well. And so the distinction between public and private is largely erased in a totalitarian regime. The claim of the regime is to the total person, in other words. Now, I lay that out, and then I tell you that this is to some degree kind of a simplified portrait of what life was like in Nazi Germany. The truth, in fact, is a little bit different with respect to what is unfolding in Germany after Hitler takes power in 1933. So you have a traditional image of Nazi Germany. That traditional image is that we're dealing with a very highly centralized, a well-tuned system, which is dominated by party ideologues working at the top, sending orders down, a well-oiled stream of command so that everybody knows precisely what needs to be done. And then everybody executes the orders that they receive through this chain of command. Surprisingly, this was not so much the case in Nazi Germany. The more historians studied an increasing number of documents, and I would suggest that this began roughly 20 to 30 years ago, the more they realized that what you're looking at in Nazi Germany is organized chaos, institutional Darwinism, a combination of totalitarian rigidity on the one hand and a very fluid organizational structure on the other. Offices multiplied in Nazi Germany. Hitler never engaged in the sort of a purge of top officials, aside from on one occasion, the night of the Long Knives, on the 30th of June 1934, when Röhm and other people within the SA, the Brown Shirt organization, were purged from the party. You never see in Nazi Germany the equivalent of Stalin's show trials that went on and on in the 1930s, the purges that you saw in the Soviet Union. Instead, under Hitler, when someone fell out of favor with Hitler, when someone didn't get the job done, they weren't fired. Rather, another person was appointed to do precisely the same thing. Okay? Ad hoc organizations were created, in other words, consistently during the Third Reich. And one found then competing jurisdictions, people supposedly assigned to do precisely the same thing, several governmental organizations charged with absolutely the same task. So overlapping jurisdiction, organizational chaos was very common in Nazi Germany. Now, the question has often been raised, and perhaps the person who has dealt with this the most is a British professor by the name of Ian Kershaw. I hope many of you have heard his name because he has a 2-volume history or biography of Hitler, which I think stands as the very best biography. But historians have looked at this and asked, was this a conscious plan on Hitler's part? Was this a means to control the situation, to maximize his own power, in other words, or was this somehow some part of his personal style? And I think the more historians have looked at Hitler, have studied him, have studied his past, have studied his everyday life, from childhood on, the more it appears that this was not a conscious thing. This was part of who Hitler was as an individual. The thing is, if you can ask that question, then you can come up with the opposite statement and say, no, this was a conscious plan on his part. If it took decades to analyze this and say, no, this was part of Hitler, well, you can ask yourself, well, what did people think back in the mid-1930s? Until the death of Hindenburg. Hindenburg was the president of the Weimar Republic, and then he's the last president who dies in office in 1934 after Hitler has taken power. Until Hindenburg's death, Hindenburg was this great war hero from the First World War, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Hitler held regular cabinet meetings. He made an effort to be at the Reichschancellery in Berlin virtually every morning. He held appointments with various state officials. He signed documents. He hated to sign documents. Hitler hated to sign documents. After Hindenburg's death, he dies the beginning of August 1934, cabinet meetings became irregular, and the cabinet never met again at all after 1938. 38 is only 5 years into a 12-year regime. The cabinet never met again. Ministers of government were forbidden to meet collectively informally. They were forced to submit legislative drafts for things that they wanted to get done to the Secretary of the Reichschancellery, Hans Lammers. Lammers, consequently, was the doorkeeper here for all of the major governmental officials. Lammers read everything, and he determined what Hitler would see and what he didn't see. Only when all issues were resolved and a consensus was achieved amongst various ministerial officials were people then taken in to see Hitler. The same procedure was true within the Nazi Party. You need to recognize, I think, that Nazi Germany was a state that has two heads, and this was the same in the Soviet Union. You had a party structure, and you also had the traditional state structure. Within the party, the same issue is at work here. Now I'm showing you the hierarchy here of the party. The party has a variety of officials, beginning with the Reichsleiter, which most people would assume is probably the most powerful official in the party, the national leader. The fact of the matter is, the better position to be in if you were a party official who wanted to get things done and who wanted to probably pad your own pocket was Gauleiter. These were the regional leaders of the party. The Gauleiters were forbidden to meet outside of Hitler's presence, very similar to cabinet members. Okay? Hitler refused to meet them on any particular issue unless there was unanimity in terms of what they wanted to get done. He did not want, this is a fascinating aspect of Hitler's personality, he did not want to be put in a position where he had to choose one of his lieutenants over another. That's probably not the image of Adolf Hitler that you have, okay? He didn't want to be in that position. So Gauleiter met with Hitler only when all of the problems between them was resolved. And that's obviously very difficult to do if you're not allowed to meet with one another, okay? Now, in terms of the party, Rudolf Hess, served as the gatekeeper in the same way as Hans Lammers did for state officials. He made the determination up until May of 1941 as to who would get in to see Hitler after he read the documentation. And I point out May of 41, many of you probably know that Rudolf Hess got a plane, he could fly, he flew the plane to Scotland and thought he was doing Hitler a favor by, Hess took Hitler serious when Hitler said that the British are our racial cousins. We shouldn't be at war with the British. And so he believed that, and he decided he would do Hitler's bidding. Hitler disowned him when he did this. And as you probably all know, Hess then was in prison for the rest of the war, and then he was the prisoner at Spandau prison just outside of Berlin until he died. After he did that, the man who took his place, who was kind of his deputy, was Martin Bormann, a much more sinister figure, actually, than was Rudolf Hess. And so Bormann served in this position for the party as the gatekeeper until the end of the war. So what you find then is that there's no real hierarchy at work in the way that one might assume a typical hierarchy might operate even in a democracy, let alone in a totalitarian regime. The key to success was getting access to Hitler. And getting access to Hitler meant getting through Lammers when it came to the Reichschancellery, or getting through either Hess or Bormann when it came to party officials, Gauleiter. There's some famous film footage that comes from the Obersalzberg, where Hitler had his Bavarian Alpine retreat, which I think actually very accurately portrays Hitler's retinue trying to get close to their Führer. This is absolutely essential. After August of 1934, after Hindenburg's death, Hitler rarely showed up in his office. It was very difficult to find out where he was going to be at any one time, which is one of the reasons why it was so difficult to assassinate him. Now, while making Hitler the final arbiter of all these issues, this procedure is full of pitfalls, as you might imagine. Hitler did not like to be burdened by bureaucratic duties. He really did lead the life of a bohemian. Hindenburg once said, this was before he appointed him chancellor, he said he didn't want to do anything. He didn't want to meet with that bohemian corporal, a terminology that he used for Hitler. And he just didn't mean that, that Hitler was from the western part of Czechoslovakia. He meant his lifestyle, the way that the guy lived. And he actually had a point here, even though at this point in Hindenburg's life he was already becoming senile. Hitler moved from place to place. He hated Berlin. He hated Berlin. He never forgave the capital for having gone communist and social democrat in the last election that was held in March of 1933. This is after Hitler's been appointed as chancellor. And yet, in the capital, a majority of votes went to the communists and the social democrats. I remember back in 1990 when the wall came down in November of 1989, and in 1990 they started to talk obviously about unification of the country again. And people were so uneasy about the idea of the capital being moved from Bonn to Berlin. Because in so many people's minds, Berlin represented militarism, it represented Nazism. The fact of the matter is, for Hitler, Berlin represented communism and socialism. And that's what I often said to people when they said this. You know, probably Bonn was much more conservative in the 1920s and 30s than was Berlin. But in any case, I understood the response, but it was nonetheless, I think, inaccurate. He spent an inordinate amount of time here at his Alpine retreat in the Alps. He also spent considerable time at party headquarters, which were not in Berlin, they were in Munich. Again, he avoided Berlin as much as he could. He also kept increasingly idiosyncratic hours, which I think is something that maybe Hindenburg actually understood. He began his day quite late, usually about 11 in the morning. He worked for about an hour. He saw various people. He lunched from noon until 2 o'clock. He napped in the afternoon, carried on, you know, when I say this in my classes, you know, I teach Nazi Germany, he said, students think, yeah, that's the way. Yeah, of course. Why do you always teach your courses at 8 o'clock? Don't, you know, I do, but, you know, Hitler lived a lifestyle that would be great for an undergraduate, I think. He ate his evening meal, then he would entertain old cronies, people from the Kampfzeit, the period of struggle before he's appointed chancellor. And then they would adjourn usually to this projection room in which they would watch movies in the wee hours of the morning till like 2 or 3 o'clock, which is obviously why he gets up so late. He especially enjoyed Hollywood movies. He had all kinds of nasty things to say about America, but he particularly enjoyed movies that were made in Hollywood, entertainment movies. So in any case, governing was, under these circumstances, quite difficult. It's extremely hard to see the man. As Hess and Lammers discovered, he also had this terrible tendency to say yes to the last person he saw. The task would be to see Hitler, which is why getting an invitation there was really like a pot of gold. If you saw Hitler, you would spew forth your idea, your plan, what you wanted to do, whatever the pet project was. And Hitler, unless he heard something that really offended him, would generally say yes. And then you'd go back to your region and say that you were working on the basis of a Führer order. And it was all verbal. Now, Hitler had a terrifically good memory, so he did know who he said yes to, even if he didn't listen to you all that closely. Hitler rarely gave written commands, especially after 1934. I think this is very important, especially in light of something that happened, my gosh, it must be 25 to 30 years ago, this idea that, that Hitler had kept a diary. And unfortunately, a very famous German historian validated that diary was accurate until it turned out that no, it wasn't. The man simply didn't like to write things down. You know, even Mein Kampf was basically dictated when he was in Landsberg prison after the beer hall putsch in 1933 or 1923-24. It was dictated to Rudolf Hess, was one of the people who took a lot of his dictation. So the implications then for the Third Reich was that offices multiplied, competencies overlapped, and both within the party as well as within the state. Again, I see this kind of as a two-headed hydra here. People were often given okays to do things by Hitler for all sorts of special pet projects. Ad hoc offices were created. And this would later haunt the regime. You know, it doesn't do it so much before the war, but during the war, it certainly does. There were no fewer than 5 different offices, including the economics ministry, that were charged with economic policy. That's not a good thing during a total war, okay? So in an area that's as crucial as war planning, you had this organizational chaos. Hitler rarely intervened in local or regional affairs. You know, so long as basic policy was being followed, basic policy is being executed, he kept his hands off. He saw himself as a big picture man. Now, most of us, you know, I served in administration, and I always appreciated when I had an administrator who let me deal with the details, okay? Well, I guess to some degree, Hitler's that way. He was definitely not somebody who dealt with the minutia of what you were doing. He didn't look over your shoulder. So he outlined the basic features of policy for the Third Reich, and he was perfectly happy to let local leaders and the Gauleiter struggle on how to implement that policy. Okay. Ian Kershaw came up with a document by really a mid-level bureaucratic official who at one point said that my job is to work towards the Fuhrer. And it hit Kershaw in a way that I think it was a real eye-opener for him. Yes, this is precisely the way the regime functioned. Okay, I've read Mein Kampf, I know what Hitler wants to do, and I need to work towards his goals. So working towards the Fuhrer is the way things operated, I would suggest, from the beginning to the end. Absolutely crucial, I think. Now, the same pattern, I think, led to conflicts between the party and the state. And they had to resolve themselves. There's a great example of this. Wilhelm Frick, who was the Minister of the Interior. The Minister of the Interior in Germany, in fact, this is still true today, is not somebody who deals with spotted owls and snail darters. He's in control of the police. Okay? Well, obviously, Himmler, as the head of the SS, is also in control of police forces. Eventually, the Gestapo falls within his portfolio. And so Frick wants to push through a law that says that the SA and the SS also have to obey the law. The new law is simply ignored by Himmler. This thoroughly enraged Frick, and Frick actually said to Himmler, you have to follow the law. And Himmler said, I know what the Fuhrer wants. And obviously he didn't obey the law. Hitler didn't intervene. He stood above the conflict. And this was quite typical of how things ran in the Third Reich. Regional leaders, Gauleiter, treated their domains as if they were fiefdoms. They had control over their domains. And if you were just a common German, where you lived had an impact on how much you felt the weight of the state. Clearly, if you lived in Nuremberg, Upper Franconia, life could be hellish. Certainly if you were a Jew, but even if you weren't a Jew, you had to toe the line much more in a place like that than you might in somewhere like Hamburg. Fuhrer orders, again, were very vague. They were very general. They forced local and regional officials to determine what it was that Hitler meant. And sometimes they were so vague that these orders were ignored. The Jewish boycott, most of you are familiar with this. The 1st of April 1933, there was a boycott. That boycott was supposed to go on for several days. Then it was going to be temporarily called off, and then it was to be renewed. The problems associated with that boycott, something that the Nazis had not worked out. You know, the fact if you boycott Jewish businesses, German banks are going to be impacted. Hadn't thought of that. And there was so much negative publicity externally on this that the boycott is called off after roughly 36 hours. This is an example, I think, because whereas it's called off, it goes on in Nuremberg. Even though the boycott had been halted. Nuremberg was the home of this notorious Gauleiter by the name of Julius Streicher, who was probably, I mean, his anti-Semitism borders on pornography. It's so nasty. This guy had some serious problems, and yet he's in a significant position. He keeps the boycott going. He said he doesn't want to rescind the boycott because he knows what Hitler really wants. Hitler never called him on the carpet for this. Okay? Hitler doesn't intervene. Obviously, Streicher maybe was right. Okay? Albert Speer, familiar with Albert Speer? Albert Speer is one of those 5 different officials that's running economic policy by the end of the war. Albert Speer's description Speer can't be believed on a lot of things. So if you've read Inside the Third Reich, you know, you have to be careful with certain aspects of it. Obviously, he's attempting to whitewash his own personal involvement. And his involvement really, had it been known at the time, he probably would have been executed. But he gets a prison term and he's ultimately released. He doesn't live long after his release. So if you read his work, if you read his autobiographical work, do so with some caution. Nonetheless, his description of the way that the regime functioned, I think, is quite accurate. Speer brought order to Germany's, I think, very chaotic economic policies. He does so late. It's 1944. It's probably fortunate for everyone that he's not put in this position earlier than 44, because he actually does a reasonably good job. Speer says this, and this is Inside the Third Reich: the constitutional forms of our organization were just as improvised and vague as all these arrangements. He's been talking about much of what I've been saying here. There was no precise statement of my assignments or jurisdiction. My feeling was that I was better off without such definitions. I did my best to keep the situation fluid. Okay? He knew what he wanted to get done, and he was better off working for somebody who basically gave him free rein to do what he needed to do. Okay. Later on, in the same book, Speer writes, and this is in reference to having a conversation with Hitler about economic organization. He writes, whenever I explained my organizational plans to Hitler, he showed a striking lack of interest. I had the impression that he did not like to deal with these questions. Indeed, in certain realms, he was altogether incapable of distinguishing the important from the unimportant. You know, that rings true. That makes a lot of sense to me. You know, Hitler had genius in some respects, and in other respects, obviously, he relied on other people who could do things for him because they were the experts. He also didn't like establishing clear lines of jurisdiction. Sometimes he deliberately assigned bureaus or individuals the same or similar tasks. That way, he used to say, the stronger gets the job done. Okay. Yeah. He understood this, okay? So this sort of organizational chaos, or institutional Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, okay? This is part of the foundation of Nazi Germany. It's a central organizing principle. Now, I think one nonetheless has to keep in mind that this system of ideology and propaganda, the relentless good news that tends to balance the uglier features of the regime if you're living through this, you need to note that the view from below was quite different from the view above. You know, the view from the average, you know, Hans Schmidt down here as opposed to Albert Speer up here is quite different. Okay? The organizational chaos is only evident up above, which I think is one of the reasons why I think for several decades after the end of the Second World War, we had this other notion of this finely oiled regime, this finely oiled system that we gradually came to realize was not the case. The average citizen of the Third Reich believed that the methods of the regime were calculated, that they could be understood. But for them, there was a degree of uncertainty, there was a degree of confusion, but it was calculated. It was part of the process. People were left with no fixed points of orientation. There was no reality after 1934 that was not a National Socialist reality. Now, obviously, you can see that through Jewish eyes in one way, but you can also see it through non-Jewish eyes. There was no way to find opposing viewpoints reflected in the national media. You couldn't go to the editorial page and read a different opinion about this particular policy that the regime has. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. And the propaganda is consistently hammering away at all of the positive things that the regime is doing. And again, unless you have a certain degree of astute acuity here, you're going to buy into this. You're going to believe it. What is the regime doing? What's it doing for Germany? And it's constantly focusing people on the good news, okay? What the Third Reich has done for you. Certainly done a lot more than the Weimar Republic did for you, didn't it? And you could make that argument. Certainly they did. There's no such thing as bad news reported in the press. It doesn't exist. And so the media is dominated also by this never-ending round of official Nazi activities. The national celebration, for example, of Hitler's birthday on the 20th of April. The celebration of the Beer Hall Putsch. The Beer Hall Putsch took place on the 8th and 9th of November, 1923. The celebration of Wessel's death. Horst Wessel was a member of the SA who was in a leadership position in Berlin during the days in which they were fighting tooth and nail with the communists. And he's actually assassinated by a communist on the 23rd of February, 1930. Well, the 23rd of February then becomes a holy day because he has written that becomes, by and large, the German national anthem. It certainly is the Nazi national anthem, the Horst Wessel Lied. The Nuremberg Party Rally in September, this week-long event, which it comes about with incredible fanfare. This is really the highlight of the National Socialist calendar, what happens in Nuremberg. These events, over and over and over. It almost seemed as if no week passed without some celebration which brought your attention to, wow, how great and wonderful Nazi Germany is and Adolf Hitler is. Moreover, social life was organized. And I'm not talking about just the major institutions of government and economy and so forth. Children were organized. As you can see here, you have here on the far side from me is the Hitler Youth. They're surrounded by Baldur von Schirach was the leader of the Hitler Youth, and he's standing in the middle. You have the Bund Deutsche Mädel in the middle here, and then this wonderful poster on the end here that. Officers, these are the officers of tomorrow, the Hitler Youth. Hitler Youth were basically, Hitler Youth is an umbrella term. It covers both boys and girls, okay? We mostly think of it as the boys. The Hitler Youth, or the Hitler Jungen, were boys aged 15 to 18. Before you're 15, between the ages of 10 and 14, you can belong to the Jungvolk. It's almost like the Cub Scouts before you get into the Boy Scouts. I don't want to stretch that analogy too much, but I want you to know anyhow. Okay, then you had the Bund Deutsche Mädel, which was also for girls that were 15 to 18. And you had then the Jungmädel, I guess again you'd say the brownies here, for girls who were 10 to 14. So they're organized. That shouldn't be a surprise, okay? Parties were doing this in the Weimar period as well. Women, however, were then in the National Sozialistische Frauenschaft, okay? In addition, you had the National Socialist Student League. National Socialist Teachers League. You had a National Socialist Attorneys League. You even had a National Socialist Barbers League, whose slogan was, "Barbers too face great tasks." Okay? I guess to cut the hair short enough to get the helmets, but in any case, I think what's important here is all these organizations, they reinforced a sense of belonging. Okay? They all had uniforms. They all had small party badges. All of the party badges, obviously, sporting the swastika. Armbands, regular meetings, special flags, special slogans, as I've just told you, with the National Socialist Barbers League. What they do is they Nazify German life, they militarize German life for almost everyone. Almost everyone. This is something that had not existed before the First World War. It's something that's already kicked off, however, during the Weimar period, because most parties created their own, they created their own youth leagues, and they created their own kind of paramilitary force, similar to the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, which were created very early in the history of the Nazi Party. Now, also absorbed by the Nazis were sporting clubs, choral societies, local football leagues. You couldn't be in a local football league or in a choral society that was not Nazi. Okay? Gradually, they're all Nazi. Okay? All of these aimed at this positive imagery that I've alluded to again, over and over again. And very often they like to focus on Hitler as the populist, and you feel this in both of these photos here. Hitler with a spade, beginning the construction of one of the Autobahn, the highways. Hitler at the Erntefest, the Harvest Festival. In this picture here, this is a wonderful picture because not only is Hitler in it, but Leni Riefenstahl is in it. And you can see she's having a jolly time there, isn't she? So Hitler's a man of the people. You know, who can be opposed to this? Obviously, you're going to see, if you're going to go to the cinema, you're going to see this. If you're going to read the newspaper or the magazines, you're going to see this. The unemployed had disappeared from the streets. You know, there was terrific unemployment, obviously, in the last couple of years of the Weimar Republic. So they've all been drafted into the labor front. Now, to be sure, to some degree, FDR is doing something similar with the Civilian Conservation Corps at almost the same time, although the goals of the two were quite a bit different. They're all given uniforms in the labor front, and they're given shovels, which they're taught to march with and handle as if they're weapons. And indeed, the enthusiasm of the population was, you know, undeniable. Everyone seemed to be behind the regime. You know, if you're an individual and you have any doubt, that's a difficult thing for you. Okay. No opposition is expressed. There's no more pitched battles in the street, such as the one that ended up getting Horst Wessel killed. The communists were either dead, they'd gone into exile, or they were in concentration camps. So you didn't have to worry about them anymore. So if you have doubts, if you have questions about Nazi policy, who can you talk to about those doubts and questions? You couldn't read anything in the newspapers, as I've already pointed out, that might reinforce your doubts. You couldn't write a letter to the editor. Boy, that'd be a dangerous thing to do, okay? And your friends, who you've had since before the regime, are increasingly wary about talking to you about anything. So what that means ultimately is you start having self-doubt. Maybe it's me that's out of step. Maybe I'm not understanding what's going on, assuming that you had enough sense about yourself to have doubts. Now, If propaganda wasn't enough, as we've already pointed out, there was always terror. And there was certainly that. The SS, the Gestapo, the secret state police, were given authority to ferret out enemies of the state, and they were given authority to do it in any way that was necessary. Extraordinary measures, in other words. This was Gestapo headquarters in Berlin on Prinz Albrecht Strasse. Today there is a museum there called the Museum of Terror. And it's worth going to get an understanding of how the regime functioned. The first time I was at this site, the Berlin Wall was still up, and it basically was on this near side of the street. And that was just a bombed out area. That used to be a palace of a fellow by the name of Prince Albrecht, but it was taken over then by the Gestapo. The Gestapo then was given authority to do what was ever needed, and of course that meant for a lot of people being sent to concentration camps. The concentration camps were filled with political prisoners, and indeed I want to point out, because this is something that very often goes left unsaid, that was the primary purpose of the concentration camps. The concentration camps, the first key one was Dachau by the end of March of 1933. These were not created for Jews. They were created for political prisoners. Now, if you happen to be a communist as well as a Jew, that was a double whammy, to be sure. But it's only in 1938 that you start to see Jews being arrested largely because they're Jews. Okay. Again, it's not that Jews weren't arrested, but generally speaking, before 1938, they were arrested for other reasons. Okay. Then gradually, obviously, by the end of the war, most of these camps are in fact filled with Jews and others, but certainly Jews. Now the Gestapo evolves a very scientific system for how to engage in terror. They determined that the best time to make arrests were in the wee hours of the morning, 2, 3 o'clock. People are at their most vulnerable at this time. And so this is when they would go knock on a door and take somebody away. And this serves several purposes. Obviously one, as I pointed out, is it makes the victim more vulnerable. Taking him or her down to Gestapo headquarters for questioning at this point. The neighbors didn't generally see it. They very often heard it, but they didn't see it. They might hear something in the hallway of the apartment building if it's in a larger city, such as Berlin. And you know, the next morning, you know, one of the neighbors might say to another neighbor, "Did you hear? Frau Müller had a visitor last night," and it wasn't a romantic call. So men in black leather coats came by. "I wonder what's going on. I wonder what Frau Müller did." You know, wonder what Frau Müller did. She clearly isn't reliable, and maybe I could have guessed that had I been paying attention. You know, that was typical. So rumor and fear tended to be there, tended to mount. One didn't ask too many questions. People didn't speak to one another a great deal unless you had absolute faith in the person that you're speaking to. The Gestapo always also learned that people were quite willing to inform on their neighbors. Okay? It wasn't necessary to have a vast secret police network. There's a professor at Florida State named Robert Gelately who has done significant work on the Gestapo and has really worked this out. You know, people, and by the way, the Stasi did the same thing during the communist regime. You had informants who might have gotten paid and might not have gotten paid, but informants, the Gestapo had informants. If you had a grudge against your neighbor, you know, let's say that your neighbor had a dog and the dog barked all the time and barked into the night, and you complained, but there was no response. And so you make an anonymous call to the Gestapo. and the neighbor gets arrested and is drug in for questioning, and perhaps is held for unsocial behavior, because unsocial behavior was in fact one of the crimes you could be arrested for. Unsocial behavior, not quite sure what that is. The Gestapo also discovered that there were in fact brave people out there. There were people who were prepared to throw their lives away to publicly express opposition to the regime. Now, the problem with this is it was a quixotic effort on the part of the person. This never got publicized in the press. It was never covered, and it wouldn't be covered. It didn't get on the radio, so to some degree you have to ask what exactly it accomplished. But there were certainly people, and there weren't just a few of them. There were quite a number of people who were quite courageous, and they lost their lives because of it. The Gestapo thus came up with something which is actually fairly old in German history. It goes back to the Middle Ages. A practice called Sippenhaft. This is basically translated as the incarceration of one's kin. Does that work for you? Sippenhaft?
Ich weiß nicht. Was meinst du, Hildebrand?
Yeah. Okay, relatives, family, incarceration of your kin. So, not only would they arrest you, but they may arrest your children. They may arrest your parents. They may arrest your husband or your wife. In fact, it could go to more distant relatives and even friends on certain occasions. So they knew, in other words, that there were many brave people out there who were willing to risk their own lives. But there weren't that many people who were willing to see their parents or their children or their husband or their wife arrested for something that they did. And so Sippenhaft was a very calculated decision on the part of the Gestapo here. So this system of terror is certainly in place. But what one witnesses, and to some degree this might seem to be a dichotomy, is both the collectivization as well as the atomization of life, of society. From labor unions to social clubs, German social life is atomized. What I mean by that is you're collectivized, but you don't know what to talk about. You have to be very careful in what you say in your choral society to the person singing bass next to you, okay? You have to be careful. The Nazi Party infiltrates virtually all areas of social interaction. And indeed, people spoke less freely as time passed. Even within the family. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Remember, the children are virtually, a lot of them, not everybody, but a lot of them are in the Hitler Youth. But even if they're not in the Hitler Youth, they're encouraged to report on their family. If they hear something that might be subversive, well, what does that mean? Okay. So the breakdown, as I pointed out before, between the public and the private life, what it means to live in a totalitarian society, this becomes the norm. One could, again, get in trouble certainly for objective crimes, for what you've done out in public. But you could also get in trouble for subjective crimes. And basically what I mean here is what you think, especially if you express what you think. Laws were also enforced retroactively. This is an especially pernicious development. Let me give you an example. If you might be a happy Nazi in 1938, and somebody digs in the file and finds out that you were a social democrat in 1928. You could get called in and questioned because you had been a social democrat 10 years earlier here. And so that kind of harassment was something that people had to live with for obviously what in 1938 was deemed to be a past sin. And as I noted, neighbors and family members are encouraged to inform on one another. Again, Robert Golately has done magnificent work on this in his book Gestapo in German Society. Each building, if you saw that hierarchy where I had Reichsleiter and Gauleiter and so forth down to the bottom level was called the Blockwart. The Blockwart, or the Blockwärter in plural, these were the Nazi representatives at the basic level. You know, if you were a basic, average, everyday German and you only knew one Nazi, that one Nazi was probably the Blockwart. He's the person that keeps an eye on what's going on. He ensures conformity in his domain. His domain might be a city block. It might be larger than that if he's living in a more rural area. He ensures that the flags are put out at the appropriate times, for example, on Hitler's birthday. Make sure that the swastika is out. He ensured that people were listening to the radio, the Volksempfänger, when an important speech was being made, maybe by Goebbels, could be by Hitler. These mass-produced speeches. By the way, the radios were the mass-produced thing. The Volksempfänger, the people's radio, was mass-produced so that virtually everyone could have this relatively inexpensive radio, so that you could listen to Nazi speeches. People could be arrested for anti-community minded or anti-social behavior and placed in protective custody for not having had the radio on at the right time. You might only be held for an hour or two, but the impact was devastating, absolutely devastating. And obviously you didn't express rage too openly, and you certainly didn't even in your own family. The system of terror, I think, is very well represented in one of the vignettes that Bertolt Brecht wrote in his book, which was translated, The Private Life of the Master Race. It's actually a fear and trembling or something like that in the Third Reich in German. In this one vignette, a mother and father are sitting down and having breakfast one morning. And they have a little boy, we'll say his name was Hans. They're eating breakfast, and the father is complaining that he's being fed margarine at breakfast when he thought he was going to be able to get butter in the glorious Third Reich. And for those of you who are old enough, you know that margarine was white back in the 1930s. I still remember the yellow coloring that we mixed in with to make it look like butter, you know. So complaining about margarine, you know, which probably looked like lard, makes sense, or shortening. So he's complaining, and he said, you know, I thought life was going to be better, and his wife says, I'm sorry, I just can't find it at the store. And so they go on like this, with the father complaining about the situation, and little Hans is sent off to the store to get something. You know, I have this image again. This is a time capsule here of Ralph and Alice Cramden in The Honeymooners. You know, every time I talk about this, I see Ralph complaining to Alice, you know, where's the butter? In any case, he's going on like this, and little Fritz is gone, or Fritz, Hans, whatever, and he doesn't come back, and he doesn't come back, and he doesn't come back, and suddenly, the father says, "Where's he gone? He's had plenty of time to get to the store and back several times. Where's he?" Says, "What were we talking about when he left?" And this is really where I think of The Honeymooners. She says, "You were complaining about the lack of butter in the Third Reich," and he's, "That wasn't a complaint. It was just a comment. You know, I'm true to the Führer." And so they keep talking, but now they're talking with fear and trembling. About, you know, what little Hans may be up to, and then he shows up. You know, this 10-year-old kid. He's just been. he's just been gallivanting. He's been, you know, dawdling on the street, and I can remember being this age and knowing exactly what that was like. If I saw a huge spider or something, I could spend 15, 20 minutes just looking at the spider. And maybe thinking, where can I find a fly to give to this thing, you know? I did things like that. But in any case, he shows up, and nothing's happened. But the impact of the scene, you know, I think Bertolt Brecht was fabulous in this particular piece. All of you know who Bertolt Brecht wrote these famous pieces that Kurt Weill set to music in the 1920s, The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni, the Threepenny Opera. Now, many Germans, looking back on the Third Reich, they don't recall overt fear. They don't recall constantly looking over their shoulders, assuming that the Gestapo was watching them. But they do recall kind of an internalized fear that was a little more subconscious. It was there, but they didn't think about it a lot. I studied in Israel several years ago. In 2004, I was at Yad Vashem, and I was studying the Holocaust there. And I remember going into the stores, and there were guards in so many of the stores. And you actually went into through these metal detectors just to go in and buy a bottle of water and come back out. And I remember taking this wide loop around a bus stop because this was a time when bombs were. In fact, the day I flew out, a bomb blew up on one of the buses, and I got off the plane coming home at Heathrow Airport, and I got on one of those tram things that took me to another terminal. And I remember this sense of anxiety just kind of draining out of me, and I didn't even know it was there. I didn't even know it was there. And that experience, I think, helps me understand kind of what they're talking about here. A sense of anxiety which wasn't absolute fearfulness all the time, but it's there, it's in the background. One did things certain ways in order not to get in trouble, you know. One went through the motions. You put out the flag, you turned on the radio. And those of you who have lived in Europe know this. European homes are different. We've taken the doors down in most of our homes, and if you go farther west in this country, there's no doorways in a lot of rooms. In Europe, you can close the door and go into another part of the house, and you don't have to listen to the radio. And they're just designed so that there's more privacy inside the homes. And so when the Blockwart comes by, you've got the radio, you might have the window open, and he goes by with his list and he checks it off, you know, Frau Müller, she's okay, no problem, she's got the radio on. So people live their lives without attracting too much attention. This is often referred to as internal immigration. You don't get out of the country, but somehow you have removed yourself from what's going on, leading these intensely private lives with, I think, really perverted social interaction with whatever organizations that you might be involved in. The Gestapo reports, there were Gestapo reports called Stimmen der Bevölkerung, which is translated as Voice of the People. They suggest that the Gestapo didn't believe that people were all that loyal, that they were all that committed. In fact, what the Nazis counted on was not wholesale commitment to the ideological goals of the party, but by and large apathy. Apathy. People, you know, each atomized person looking out for number one. Not bothering to take any other step. You know, if one had misgivings, if one had doubts, if one had concerns, it's impossible to find reinforcement. You couldn't confide in friends. There was little organized discussion outside of official Nazi supervision. Because if there was discussion, you had to worry, would somebody inform? You might tell a joke in a bar, and by the way, there were lots of jokes. You might tell a joke in the bar. There were plenty of going right. Yeah, I'm Aryan. I'm blonde like Hitler. You know, I'm tall like Goebbels, who was a little pipsqueak. And I'm slender like Goering, who couldn't see his shoes, he was so fat. And everybody would roar with laughter. You might get away with that one night, and then the next time you said it, you'd be arrested and taken down to Gestapo headquarters. And your treatment was not going to be very nice. So basically the unpredictability, the insecurity was a key in all of this. People were kind of left with no fixed points of orientation that weren't Nazi or National Socialist. There's a very public display, as I've already pointed out, of what the Nazis are accomplishing, what's happening. Law and order have been restored. And that's to some degree true. The laws keep changing, but to some degree true. Political stability, there's no more clashes in the streets. There's only one political party. All the others were outlawed on the 14th of July, 1933. There are no other political parties. There are no battles with communists because the communists, as I pointed out, are all gone or they're in hiding. The class conflict that plagued the Weimar Republic, it's gone, it's over. The Nazis have created what they refer to as a Volksgemeinschaft. You know, the rough translation of that is a people's community. It has a very cozy feeling to it. It's actually, I think, more appropriately translated as racial community. Everything was Volks something. You had the Volksempfänger for the radio, the people's radio, basically. Mr. and Mrs. Were replaced with Volksgenosse, or people's comrade. In 1937, the Volkswagen was introduced. Everyone should have a car. Everyone should. They were not able to mass produce these until the Federal Republic of Germany came along after the war. But in any case, that's for those of you who drive Volkswagens, you know, this is obviously where it comes from. But this term Gemeinschaft, I think, is important too. The concept of a community as opposed to a society. Gemeinschaft as opposed to Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft is something that is it's artificial. It's something associated with the asphalt jungle associated with the cities. A Gemeinschaft, a community, is cozy. It's gemütlich. And that's what the Nazis supposedly were after here. I've got down here that a Gemeinschaft is something that's deemed to be organic. Everything, all the parts are connected. You know, if you're in agriculture, you can buy into this. And of course, the Nazis were very fond of speaking of Blut und Boden, blood and earth, blood and soil, and bringing up concepts that were kind of opposed to city life. So it's an important concept, I think, Gemeinschaft, community. German society was really undergoing a revolution here, a real revolution. Its features were isolation, indoctrination, and diversion. You know, all of those celebrations, that Nazi social calendar, diversion. And the process, I think, was especially sinister. I like to end my talk with you by reading a relatively long quotation from a book, this book here, They Thought They Were Free, by Milton Mayer. Milton Mayer was an American Jew of German extraction who spoke German, and I think he was a journalist in the Chicago area. He decides to go over to Germany after the war and interview people. And that's where this book was published originally in 1953, I believe. That's where he comes up with this book. So he goes back after the war, and he interviews a large number of everyday Germans about what their life was like in the Third Reich. And one of them that he speaks to is a university instructor, professor. And I'd like to read what he says, what this fellow says to Milton Mayer. You will understand me when I say that my Middle High German, this is what he taught, my Middle High German was my life. It was all I cared about. I was a scholar, a specialist. Then suddenly I was plunged into all this new activity as the university was drawn into this new situation. Meetings, conferences, interviews, ceremonies, and above all, papers to be filled out, reports, bibliographies, lists, questionnaires. And on top of all of that were the demands of the community, the things which one had to do, was expected to participate in, that had not been there or had not been important before. It was all rigmarole, of course, but it consumed all one's energies, coming on top of the work one really wanted to do. You can see how easy it was then not to think about fundamental things. One had no time. To live in this process, the professor continues, is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me. Unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity, than most of us ever had the occasion to develop. Each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well planned, or on occasion regretted, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures that no patriotic German could resent must someday lead to, one had no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing. One day, it's over his head. I do not see, even now, your little men, your Nazi friends were not against National Socialism in principle. Men like me who were are the greater offenders, not because we knew better, that would be to say too much, but because we sensed better. Pastor Niemöller spoke for the thousands and thousands of men like me when he spoke too modestly of himself and said that when the Nazis attacked the communists, he was a little uneasy, but after all, he was not a communist, so he did nothing. And then they attacked the socialists, and he was a little uneasier, but still, he was not a socialist, and he did nothing. And then the schools, the press, the Jews, and so on, and he was always uneasier, but still he did nothing. And then they attacked the church, and he was a churchman, and he did something, but then it was too late. You see, one doesn't see exactly where or how to move. Believe me, this is true. Each act, each occasion is worse than the last, but only a little worse. You wait for the next and the next. You wait for one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock comes, will join with you in resisting somehow. You don't want to act or even talk alone. You don't want to go out of your way to make trouble. Why not? Well, you're not in the habit of doing it. And it's not just fear of standing alone that restrains you. It's also genuine uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important factor, and instead of decreasing as time goes by, it grows. Outside in the streets, in the general community, everyone is happy. One hears no protest and certainly sees none. In the university community, in your community, you speak privately to your colleagues, some of whom certainly feel as you do. But what do they say? They say, it's not so bad, or you're seeing things, or you're an alarmist. And you are an alarmist. You're saying that this must lead to this, and you can't prove it. These are the beginnings, yes, but how do you know for sure when you don't know the end? And how do you know or even surmise the end? On the one hand, your enemies, the law, the regime, the party, intimidate you. On the other, your colleagues poo-poo you as pessimistic or even neurotic. You're left with your close friends who are naturally people who have always thought as you have. But your friends are fewer now. I think that's a powerful statement. Your friends are fewer now. Where have they gone? Some have drifted off somewhere or submerged themselves in their work. You no longer see as many as you did at meetings or gatherings. Informal groups become smaller. Attendance drops off in little organizations, and the organizations themselves wither. Now, in small gatherings of your oldest friends, you feel that you're talking to yourselves, that you're isolated from the reality of things, and this weakens your confidence. So you wait, and you wait. But the one great shocking occasion when tens of thousands of people will join you never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and smallest, thousands, yes, millions, would have been sufficiently shocked if, let us say, the gassing of the Jews in 1943 had come immediately after the boycott of Jewish shops in 1933. But of course, that isn't the way it happens. In between come all of the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked for the next. Step C is not so much worse than step B, and if you did not make a stand at step B, why should you at step C, and so on to step D? Then one day, too late, your principles, if you were ever sensible of them, all rush in upon you. The burden of self-deception has grown too heavy, and some minor incident, in my case, my little boy, hardly more than a baby, saying Jew swine, collapses it all at once. And you see that everything has changed, and changed completely under your nose. The world you live in, your nation, your people, is not the world you were born in at all. The forms are all there, all untouched, all reassuring. The houses, the shops, the jobs, the meal times, the visits, the concerts, the cinema, the holidays. But the spirit, which you had never noticed because you made the lifelong mistake of identifying it with the forms, is changed. Now you live in a world of hate and fear. And the people who hate and fear do not even know it themselves. When everyone is transformed, no one is transformed. It's a powerful statement. So, thank you. Thank you.